Alright, how's it going, everyone? Good? Alright, so today we're going to continue looking at Ember, and we're going to do some what are known as CRUD pages, which stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. But before we get into that, we're going to go over a little bit about REST APIs. So as part of CRUD, which is basically building out like kind of forms that where you can create data, edit data, where you can list data and delete data, we're kind of interacting with RESTful APIs in a single page application. So it's good to have an understanding of what a REST API is, so and the conventions that kind of are typically associated with that. Okay, so to kind of start off, going back a little bit, what is an API? So the best way I like to compare the two is a lot of people have heard of GUIs, which stands for Graphical User Interface. So it's just kind of like the user interface that you use for any of your applications, whether it's like Microsoft Word or Excel or just any app that's on your computer. So an API is like a programmatic way to hook into that same functionality. So if you want to you want to get the functionality of Excel, you can hit an API and maybe do some things like that. If you want to get the functionality of Facebook, you want to get some of their data, we can do that through an API. So API, it stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's basically a programmatic way of interfacing into another application, whether it's like another website to get data, or if you want to do something like image recognition in a photo. Maybe you want to like send a photo to another service and tell me like what's in the photo. You could do that through an API, assuming that there's another service that offers that. So just to kind of think, API is just programmatic way, whereas graphical user interface is just you clicking around just the apps that you typically use on your computer. Okay, so if we think kind of like with a Facebook API, anyone have ideas of what kinds of operations they might allow us to perform? Yep, post a status through the through an API. Anything else?
Login.
Yeah, log in. Yeah, get a list of friends. So I think we see that on like dating sites. What is that one? Tinder or Bumble or one of those things. I think it's like it recommends people to date based on friends of friends. So I think it's Bumble. I'm not sure, but one of those ones where and they're doing that. They're getting a list of your friends, or they're getting your friends' friends via something like a Facebook API, and so that's how they can recommend it to you. Otherwise, they wouldn't know who your friends are. Your friends of friends. Okay, so what is CRUD? So CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. And this is just an acronym typically used for whether it's building pages or APIs, but these are kind of the operations that an API usually falls into. So I either want to create data, which would be like I want to create a post status on Facebook. I want to read all my post status via an API. I want to update a single one, or I want to delete one. So typically, most operations fall into one of these four categories. Okay, so what might CRUD look like using HTTP, which is the protocol of the web? How would we perform CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete, using HTTP? So one approach would be maybe something like this. If we were talking about Facebook posts, we might have an endpoint called list posts, and it gives us a bunch of posts. We might have an endpoint called delete post, where we send it an ID, and when we hit it, it just deletes a post for us. Another one might be create post. We send it along some data. For example, like maybe we append some data in the query string or the request body, kind of like in a form. We do it that way. Similar, we could also maybe have an endpoint for update post and send along some data. So this might work. This is kind of one approach to doing it. And so REST APIs are kind of like, when people talk about REST APIs, they're typically a convention associated with doing CRUD on API. So this was just something I made up. But REST APIs typically have there's a set of conventions people follow when they're talking about REST APIs. And one of these conventions is simple URLs. So URLs, if we're talking about posts, they would probably fall into two categories, where if we're talking about a list of posts, we'd have a URL called /post. And if we're talking about a single post, it would be /post/ some unique identifier. So simple URLs to kind of perform these operations. And then, so we have these two URLs, so post for a list of posts and a URL for a single post. Now, how do we kind of, do the create, read, update, and delete stuff? We can use the HTTP method, also sometimes called an HTTP verb, and you've probably seen this on when you've created forms, and it auto-suggested the method attribute. In HTML, there were kind of two. There was get and post. There's actually a few more HTTP methods, and these are the other ones. So there's put, patch, and delete. And when we're kind of building out APIs, we can kind of use simple URLs associated with the HTTP method to kind of dictate what type of operation we want to do. So by RESTful conventions, post is typically associated with creating something. Read is get. So whenever we click on links in the browser, or those calls that we did for homeworks or in-class demos when we said, let's do that AJAX call and get a list of Reddit posts, or what was the other one we did? GitHub profile or repos, all that kind of stuff. That was all get requests, so using the HTTP method get. Update, typically there's two. There's put and patch. And then delete, it's called delete. So putting this all together, this is basically what is typically meant by a RESTful API. If I want to get a list of posts, it would be, I'm going to use the get HTTP method, and the URL will be /post. So this will give me a list of posts, like an array of posts. If I want to get a single post, it's also get, but then, oops. Oh, my mouse didn't show up. If I want to get a single post, it would still be get, but it would be /post and some ID. So in this case, I just put 1 as an example. So this would give me just a single post. If I want to delete a post, I would use the delete HTTP method, and the URL would be just like the get one for getting a single one, but it's essentially the same thing. Post, I'm basically adding a post to a collection of posts, so the URL becomes /post. Put and patch are essentially the same thing. There's very minor differences between the two. You don't really have to think about like, okay, what are the differences? We can get into that later, but just know it's kind of meant for updating a single post. So a common interview question that you might hear is, what is a RESTful API, at least if you're getting into kind of the web industry? This is typically what people mean, so following these sets of conventions. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of build an Ember app around an API that does all this. So we'll be using AJAX calls to make all these different types of requests so that we can build pages for listing a list of posts, showing a single post, deleting a post, creating a post, and updating a post. Any questions? One thing to note here is if you look at the URL column, they're all basically, there's two forms. It's either /post or /post/ID. So they're all kind of the same. It depends on, am I dealing with a list of things or a single thing? Okay, so how do we make these requests using AJAX? So we learned about $.ajax and jQuery, and there was that type. So we said, which was the HTTP method. So we said type get and kind of all the examples before, and then we send then we put the URL. So /post. If we're talking about I want to get a single item, or what's known as a single resource, it's /post/ID, like we saw in the table. If I want to delete, I can say type delete, still /post/ID. And if I want to post, I'm going to do /post of type post, and then I'm going to send the data in this kind of data object as part of the AJAX request. This is kind of just the jQuery example. If I want to do kind of update a post, I would set the type either to put or patch, and then the URL would be /post/ID because I'm updating a single resource or a single item. And then data is also associated with it because I'm sending the data that I want changed. Any questions? Yeah.
Remember there are different kind of way that we can make an AJAX request, like such as like .get JSON.
Yep.
But
the get JSON is kind of a simpler version. It's a shorthand for this.
But do we have any other method for like such as like for post and delete and
No. Get JSON is really just this call. So if you want to get into the post, put, patch, delete, you kind of have to go back to the $.ajax and do it this way. Yeah. Also, I guess another thing I forgot to mention, the word resource, we're going to see that a little bit, at least with APIs. If we think about kind of, do you guys remember the kind of the GitHub repos API where it kind of returned a list of repos? Each one of those items is what's known as a resource. So in this example, /post, I'm getting a collection of resources. So a post, the resource is called post, and I'm getting a collection of them. In /post/1 for the get, it's just returning a single resource. When I'm deleting a resource, I'm deleting post1. So just think of post is the resource. Any other questions? Okay, so creating an API like this, it's actually, I mean, it's not something I can really teach in this class just because it's a lot of work, but Ember actually comes with something built in, so you can add 5 lines of code and you get a full RESTful API like this out of the box, just kind of built into your Ember app sort of. It's a great tool for prototyping, and it's kind of something a lot of people use, so that's what we're going to use, and this way we can kind of build out CRUD pages against a real RESTful API without really having to know how to create a RESTful API. If you're interested in learning how to build kind of a full RESTful API in whatever language, I teach ITP 405 in the spring, and that's kind of a section of that class. So if you want the slides, I put a link to it on this week here. Okay, so if you want to CD and create a new Ember app somewhere on your computer, so I'm going to CD into my school directory. All right, so to create a new Ember app, I'm going to say Ember new. And I'll just call this, let's see, CRUD. Okay, so when we do this, just a refresher, it's downloading a bunch of libraries via Node's package manager called npm, which again stands for Node Package Manager. So it's downloading a bunch of libraries. Okay, so it's done. So if I do ls, I can see, let's see, CRUD is here. So I'll cd into CRUD. And then go ahead and open up your editor. I just happen to have like a quick short command called atom, so I can just open up my current one, but you can just kind of open it up and just do, you know, file, open, and go that way to open up that folder. Okay, so what we're going to, so Ember comes with kind of an ecosystem called add-ons, and they're basically like libraries that are tailored for Ember. So we can just run one single command, and it just does all their setup for us. We don't have to like think about linking up script tags or doing a whole lot of config. It just kind of it's a great way for adding libraries and leveraging third-party things. So the way we kind of work with add-ons in Ember is we use Ember, Ember CLI, and we say Ember install and then kind of the name. So typically, you just Google for Ember add-on something like Moment. We worked with Moment kind of when we were doing a few weeks back. We could probably find some add-on. It's a great way just to quickly install libraries and use third-party code without having to do like a whole lot of setup. And so one add-on that's pretty popular in Ember is called Mirage, and this is the one that kind of gives you a full RESTful API just for prototyping against. It's basically the way it works is it kind of overrides the native Ajax object in the browser and kind of hijacks it so that we can kind of create a server that's you can simulate a full REST API just in the browser. Now, this doesn't mean you don't have to create one ever. It's just great for prototyping and running tests and that kind of thing. But eventually, if you were to create an Ember application, somebody would still need to create a REST API. This is just great for, you don't have an API, you just want to kind of work on the front end and not think about the REST API. You can use Mirage, fake out the API, and then eventually you'll just have to create a real API that mimics the one that you faked out. And so we actually use this at work a lot because a lot of we have different teams, and one team does APIs. We have another team doing front end, which is the one I'm on, and I can't actually. Sometimes we're working in parallel, and so they're working on the API. I'm working on the front end, and I don't actually have a full endpoint to hit. And so in order for me to at least like work in parallel, so I'm not just like sitting there waiting until they're done, I can leverage something like Mirage, and we just kind of agree on what these APIs, how they should work, what is what's known as a contract, and then eventually we can kind of integrate later to see, hey, does it work? So really great tool. A lot of people in the Ember ecosystem use it. I think this was actually ported over to React because some Ember people started doing some React, and they saw how valuable this was. So I think you can find this same thing that's also called Mirage in React. So the way we install this is run Ember install Ember CLI Mirage. So I'm going to go here and say Ember install Ember CLI Mirage. So whenever you run these add-ons, Ember install whatever, you have to restart Ember server. It doesn't kind of take the changes into effect, so you just have to restart it. Just something to remember. Okay, so it kind of did some things. It created some files, and now we can run Ember serve. All right, so if we visit localhost 4200, we'll see kind of our brand new Ember app. I put a link to Ember CLI Mirage here, so you can get access to that. Oh, sure. Everyone install it okay?
It says node modules appears empty. It's like you might need to run npm install.
Oh, wait, it says node modules empty?
Yeah, it says you run npm install.
Oh, maybe run.
Space in your app name?
I did.
Oh.
Don't put a space in your app name.
Yeah, I guess go through it. Yeah.
Wait, is that one?
I guess when you say Ember new, don't have spaces like my CRUD app or anything. Just call it like a single word or put hyphens in there.
I don't think I put any space.
Are you in the right directory? Does it need to be in the app directory?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Wait.
Yeah, if you do PWD or LS actually, you should see kind of all the Ember-y folders that were created.
So we're just gonna be in the same folder, like.
Yeah. So whenever you do Ember new, then CD into that folder and then run Ember serve.
So what do we do after we did the Ember new project thing?
Do CD into, I think, well, I called it CRUD, so do CD CRUD and then do Ember serve. All right, so we can go to our application template. So app templates, let's just kind of get rid of the welcome page. So just leave outlet in there. So it's just blank now. Okay, so kind of before we get into writing the front end, we need to just set up our RESTful API via Mirage. And so when we installed Mirage, it created this folder here called Mirage. And if you go to config, it kind of gives you a cheat sheet for a bunch of things. So in this case, I'm just going to kind of continue with the example of posts. It's okay, so what I'm going to do here is just kind of delete the comments and then get rid of the URL at the end, and kind of this shorthand cheat sheet thing. And so what we did was we said we're setting up an API. It's going to be, has all the different the 5 common operations, so a get request to /post, which will give us a list of posts, the post one for creating posts, getting a single post, editing a single post, and deleting a single post. And so all we have to do this, and it just sets up a REST API that's kind of built in the browser for us. Great for prototyping, great for testing. It's I can't imagine actually doing a front-end app anymore without this. There's a few other parameters here that we can set. So namespace. So namespace is if my actual if my endpoint is something like /API/v1/post or something, that prefix before the post, that becomes the namespace. So in this case, we can just say, let's pretend our API was prefixed with /API. So we'll kind of set that. Timing is also a really good one. So we could say for all of these AJAX requests, I want it to wait 400 milliseconds, or I want it to take 400 milliseconds. So this is really useful if you want to say, I want to simulate the get request to /post, and it takes 2,000 milliseconds. So what does my app look like when it's taking when the AJAX request was made, but it hasn't responded fully yet? And so it's really good for if you want to like test loading states. You want to see, okay, what does the spinner look like? Just how does the app feel when it's when an API is processing? I'm going to leave that for now. Okay, so this sets up the endpoints. Now there's another piece of Mirage that says when I hit /post, how many are going to be returned? Is it 5? Is it 10? 15? We can actually configure that in what's called the scenario. So inside scenarios, there's this file called default. And this is where we can essentially kind of seed our API with a bunch of data. So we can say, in this case, I want to make sure kind of my API starts off with 10 posts. That's kind of like what this is saying right here. There's kind of 10 posts that my API has. So whenever I call get /post, 10 will be returned. And in this function call, this is kind of, this parameter is commented out, so just delete that because we are using server down here. So delete these comments up here. I know people are going to miss this piece, so yeah, just make sure you remove the little like /*/ piece. It just says server up here because we are using server down here. Okay, so we did two parts so far with Mirage. We installed it. We set up the endpoints for a full REST API, which was this. We set the URL. We said, okay, let's start off with 10 posts in memory. So when I call get/posts, it's going to return 10. When I create one, it's going to keep this all in memory. So if I created a single post, it will now have 11. So just one more. And it'll just keep this all in memory. So I don't have to like, manage a database in a way. I just kind of keep it in memory, and it just it makes it really easy to kind of simulate what happens when I list some, create one, edit it. It all like stays in memory, which is super useful. And we'll see this kind of as we build the CRUD pages. You'll just kind of see what I mean, how it just persists in memory. Okay, so the last piece of setting up Mirage is what is known as factories. And so we have the API, we have how many we're going to create, but what attributes does a post have? Does it have a title? Does it have a body? Does it have a date? All that kind of stuff. And so we can use what's known as a factory to say, to create kind of randomized data for the different attributes. So the way we create a factory in Mirage is we go to our command line, and we're going to say Ember generate, or Ember G, Mirage-factory, and it's a post. So I'm dealing with a post resource, so I'm creating a post factory. And so what this did is it created a file called Mirage Factories Post. And you can see it kind of on the left over here. Okay, so Ember G Mirage Factory Post, that created this. And if we open this up, it's basically a class, and we can assign different attributes. So in this case, I could say, let's imagine there is a title, or let's see, a post would have, yeah, I guess a title attribute. So I can say post. We can also say there's a body. Let's just go with that for now. Okay, so now we're kind of ready to work with this. So let's go to, let's create our first route. So I'm going to go back to my command line and say Ember generate route index. And so that index route, if you remember, it's just the /URL. So I'm going to generate the index route. And this created every route, kind of as a refresher from last week, every route has kind of a JavaScript file and a template associated with it. So in this case, when I hit /, I'm going to invoke the JavaScript file and render the template called index. So if we go to routes, you can see index.js for this route. And like last week, we learned about that model function, or this model method, or often referred to as the model hook. This is where we kind of load data. And for now, I'm just going to say $.getJSON API/post, just so we can kind of see that REST API that we created using Mirage working. Okay, so at this point, our app should have been, should have made this call. We didn't render anything, but if we go and open up our console, so right click, inspect, and then console. Okay, let's see. Okay, so you should see an error. There is one other thing we have to do. So go back to our command line, and I'll kind of explain what this means in a minute, but we'll say Ember generate model called post. I'll explain this in kind of a few minutes when we get to the model section, but that'll at least get rid of the error. So now we see our get call successfully made. So now in the console, you'll see, okay, Mirage, the API responded with 200, which means successful. It made that request to API/post, and we can kind of inspect this. So if I kind of click on this a little bit, and I see response, you're going to see, okay, here's all the data. Data, attributes, and if I look at each one of these, you can see here's the body, which I said hello, and the title, which was post. Now what's inside this response property is kind of, it's the actual raw response from the AJAX call. Now this is formatted a certain way, and the format of it, you guys kind of remember when when you guys did your homework, you noticed that the Reddit API, remember that like data.children and all that kind of stuff? That looked very different from the GitHub API that we did in class, right? And so typically with these APIs, when people make them, everyone does it a little bit differently, right? And so Ember has kind of bought into a particular API structure so that it's consistent. And so when you kind of know what the API structure is, you can kind of create libraries and abstractions that make it easy to work with it. And this is a very specific type of structure here, a specific API structure. And this is what's known as JSON API. It's kind of it's an API with a lot of conventions around it. So you can see some examples here where they say, okay, your API should respond with a data attribute. All the attributes should be inside kind of a property called attributes, and there's this thing called relationships, which we'll kind of look at later. But it says, okay, it should respond like this, and it's very well thought out. And so that's what Mirage responds with. We can actually change what it responds with, but out of the box, it just makes things easy. We're just gonna go with this JSON API structure, and then we'll kind of learn later on, like, if our API responds a different way, or how do we make Mirage make it look like that. So that's what this kind of JSON API is. I put a link to it on today, or kind of right here, so if you want to check it out. It's basically like if I were creating an API today, I would make it follow JSON API. It's really well thought out, as opposed to just kind of creating my own ad hoc API structure. Okay, so that's kind of what this Mirage is responding with. That's why you're going to see these attributes, or like these different properties like type, ID, attributes. That's what we're seeing here. Another thing to note about Mirage is that you're not going to see it in the network panel. So when we were kind of learning about AJAX, we saw AJAX requests come through the network panel in Chrome, and you're not going to actually see this here. And the reason for this is AJAX is built on top of a class built into the browser called XML HTTP requests right here. And the way Mirage works is it kind of overrides this to kind of intercept all API or all AJAX calls in order to kind of simulate a server and everything. So that's why you're not going to see it in the network panel, but you will see it in the console here, and it's usually good enough. Okay, so that's setting up Mirage with a fake REST API. It's kind of a little bit to take in, but it's a lot better than creating our own. We can kind of get quickly running with creating a set of CRUD pages without having to make an API. Okay, so let's now kind of create a bunch of CRUD pages. So I think the first part of CRUD is kind of listing out a bunch of results. So we kind of did that in the previous lectures, right? So we listed GitHub repositories. And so that's kind of the R in CRUD. So create read. So we're going to read a list of posts. So let's make a page where we just show all the posts on the page. Now we could use $.getJSON for kind of making these AJAX calls, and but it does add a little bit of extra work for having to manage the data and keeping it all in sync. For when I list it, when I create it, I need to take the created data and append it to the list, and I need to kind of manage all this data and keep it so that it stays in sync in all parts of my application. So when I create a new post, that list of posts that showed it also adds it to there. And so there's like a little bit of bookkeeping there. And so Ember comes with a library for working with data and APIs called Ember Data. And it's kind of, has anybody worked with a server-side framework, ORM? Probably not. It's kind of something in ITB 405, but it's kind of like a library for working with databases. In Ember, they have something that makes it easy to work with APIs, so it's kind of like a client-side ORM, if you know what an ORM is, but I don't expect most people to. So we're going to use Ember Data to kind of work with this API, and it's just kind of a library for working with our APIs. Okay, so I'm going to delete this $.getJSON. So how do we work with Ember Data? So in our model, to kind of achieve the equivalent of saying get all posts, I can say this.store.findAll, and what's the model name? So kind of back when I said we had to create that model called post in the terminal, we're going to say, okay, I want to find all post models. And the store, it's kind of this thing in Ember known as the data store. So it's like this this global cache of all the data in our application. So we can just kind of reach into the store and ask for it when we need it, and it will handle like talking to the API, caching it, doing all kinds of neat things like that. Okay, so when I said this store find all, if we look at our app, it's going to say your Ember app tried to make a get request to /posts. But if we look at our API, it was, there was this extra namespace called /API. So how do we say, okay, append this, or prepend /API to the URL? So there's another piece. So we already created the model. Now we need to create what's known as kind of an adapter. So I'm going to say Ember generate adapter called application. And so the adapter is this layer that deals with the URL for whenever we use this store. So when I say find all posts using the store, the adapters, it's going to look to the adapter and say, okay, let's figure out what the URL is, and then I'll make the request. So I created this adapter, and it created this file inside app adapters application. And it's kind of a class by default. It extends from the JSON API. So that spec that I talked about, where it's called JSON API. So JSON API. There's an adapter in Ember or in Ember Data called JSON API. So we can say, what's the namespace? We're going to say namespace : API. So we're kind of saying, okay, here's the URL. Okay, so now if we look at our app, we were able to use the store to successfully make a GET request to /API/posts. So our response, we get back the data, no errors, everything's good. So let's kind of render all this. So I'm going to close the adapter. And if we go back to that model hook of the index route, prepend that store find all with a return function. So if you remember from before, the model hook, we're going to return the promise from an AJAX call. So this store find all returns a promise, So we're going to say return this. And what this is essentially going to do is return a promise that resolves with a list of post models. So we created that post model, and that post model is inside this models directory here. And if we look at this, it's just kind of an empty class that extends from DS. DS stands for data store. And this is where we're going to specify the attributes. So every model is going to have a title. So kind of like what we did in Mirage, where we said in the factory, we want there to be two properties, title and body. I'm going to say the title, and we're going to specify the attribute, and it's going to be a string. And then the body is also a string. So behind the scenes, that JSON API structure that Mirage responded with, Ember data is going to take all that, figure out, look where the attributes are, and create a list of post models with these two properties. Anything else, it's just going to discard. So we just have to declare what our attributes are up front on this model class. Okay, so think of this .store.findAll. It returns a promise with an array of post models. So now we can go to our template, index HBS, and let's kind of iterate over it and display the list. So I'll create maybe an unordered list. So UL, and I'll say pound each. So each model, so model is in this case a list of things, as post. And then inside the each, we're going to spit out post.title. And then we can see each post, which I just kind of hard coded it as post.
Can you put a router bucket?
Oh yeah. Oh, the index route won't create anything inside there. Yeah.
Cannot get posts 404.
Cannot get /post. Oh yeah. The adapter namespace API. That's probably what's missing. Yes.
I do not have like the post text in the thing, and I think I didn't fill out like one of the return.
Oh, okay.
Something earlier on.
In the let's see, routes inside index, is it return this post store
Not that one. I think it's before we set up that one. The application module.
Models? Do you have the attributes declared?
I have that one.
UC 200 get /API/post.
Yeah.
Inside the, let's see, the templates index HBS, you say each model as post.
Yeah.
And then post.title. The only other thing I can think of is it's not being responded with in the API. So like if you look inside response, data, attributes, you should see kind of title post. And if that's kind of empty or just not there, then I guess the data is not there.
Oh yeah, that's there.
Oh, okay. If that's the case, then it's go go to Mirage Factories post and say return post. Okay, yeah.
Can you go to the application.js?
Application, which one?
Is it the adapters thing?
Oh, the adapters. Oh, right. Yeah.
For some reason, I don't have the adapter folder.
Oh, yeah, go here and then run Ember G adapter application, and that'll create that file. Yes.
Can I see the application HBS?
Yeah, that's just outlet.
Oh, so how did you get the bullet points to
Oh, in index, I just wrapped it inside a UL.
Oh.
Okay, go back to the application.js.
Yeah, and say namespace : API. Yes.
So in that handlebars for each loop, in index,
Mhm.
so when you're reading from model, it doesn't read from, it reads from response data, like each of those.
Oh,
does
yeah.
it understand that spec?
So behind the scenes, like when you say this store find all, it fetches it, and then when it gets the response, it turns each one of the items inside of data into a model instance. So an instance of models posts this one.
Okay.
So so we're dealing with like instances of this class. So yeah, we don't really think about like the structure at all. So our application isn't like coupled to the format of the API.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you wanted, well, we'll look at it in a couple weeks, but say the API responds with not JSON API. There's another layer that we can look at, which is called the serializer, which says, okay, like by default, we're using the JSON API serializer, but we could say, okay, let's use another one to say handle this other format. So in the end, our app is still like working with the store and all that, but the specifics of the API format can be just like put in that one spot.
So, to clarify,
Yes.
actually, what's kind of going on? So, I think I get half of it.
Yeah, there's kind of a lot here.
Yeah. So within the Mirage, that's where you're the thing that I missed part. That was just that's dummy data. That'll just be repeated every single time.
Yep.
And then.
Yeah, so the Mirage Factory is the one saying, okay, inside the default scenario, we're saying, okay, create 10 posts behind the scenes. But what does each post look like? That's the factory.
And post for the scenarios is just it's an understood sort of
this right here.
Yeah, that post.
Yeah, this is just Mirage. So we're saying so this post right here has to be the same as kind of that model we created over here. So this model's post, those have to be the same name.
This has to be the same name. Okay.
Yeah.
But it could be anything.
Yeah, it could be comment or whatever. Typically, I name it the same as the resource. So if I'm saying I'm dealing with comments, I would create a comment model and that kind of thing. This one?
No. Oh, sorry, post.js.
Oh, this.
Email them to me, David.
Any other questions? It's kind of a lot of files here, so totally understand it. It's a little overwhelming. I guess the main at a high level, Mirage is just creating the API, and then we're using Ember data to consume that API as opposed to just $.ajax or $.getJSON.
Everything outside of the Mirage folder is catching what's in the Mirage folder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just normally if this class were a whole year long, then I would start off oh, let's build the API. Then we'll write the front end to consume that API, but we don't really have time to write an API. So this is the quickest tool, and it just happens to be a really good one. I use it at work too to just fake out an API so I can write the front end piece. But you do have to kind of understand, I guess, the different parts of it and like what is the API that it's making. So I guess Mirage, there's like three pieces. There's the routes, which is the get, post, put, delete. There's the scenario, which is like how many things do I want to create of each, and then the factory, which is what are the attributes. Yeah, so if like you're making a project and you don't have a backend person, great tool. You can just write this, and then once you're done making your app, you could say, "Hey, backend person, make an API that looks like my Mirage one," and then good to go. Just plug it in. Should in theory just work. And yep.
So mine is now telling me that there is no space, like nothing called API/API/posts. It asks if I forget to define the namespace.
Oh.
But I did define the namespace.
Inside adapters, is it called application?
Yeah.
Like there's no spelling errors or anything, and it has the namespace property.
Yep.
Okay, and then inside Mirage, let's see, Mirage config, you have this namespace equals /API.
No.
Oh, okay. Nice. Like what? It might seem a little overwhelming, this Ember Data Mirage thing, but it gets really useful once you kind of do it a little bit. There's a really nice add-on to say called. Has anyone heard of Firebase? Yeah. Okay, so that's like a Google thing. It it's sort of like a real-time database /API. There's also something here. There's kind of an add-on for Ember for Firebase. So if I want to say don't hit my Mirage but hit Firebase and kind of just change the adapter, and it just sort of works. There's a few tweaks because I think it's a tad outdated, but like for the most part, you can just install it and just change the adapter instead of saying application JS, say like Firebase adapter or whatever, and just everything else works, which is really nice. So it's like the API semantics are just isolated to this like Ember data layer, so you don't have to like change all the rest of your app. Okay, so we can actually make Mirage a little bit better. And so instead of saying, okay, I have 10 posts and they all have the same post, we can actually go into our Mirage factory. So I'll close this folder and open up this. And then each of these functions actually receives kind of an index for each time it's created. So in this case, I can say post, I'm going to change it to backticks, and I'll say post I. Now if I change it, we'll see post 0, post 1. So it looks at least, differentiates each item, that each post. Now we can also do the same for body. So we could say like hello 1 or hello 2. But Mirage actually comes with another library called Faker.js, and Faker is a way to stub out even more data. So I put a link to it under mocking an API with Mirage right here. So if you click on that link, it comes with all this stuff. But we can actually generate random addresses, company names, databases. Like there's all kinds of stuff. So we can just create a bunch of like randomized data. And so I think, okay, so there's one here called random. So I could say, let's create a random words. So here I'm going to say, let's import Faker. And then here, instead of returning hello, I'm going to say return faker.random.words. Okay, so we're not displaying it here, but if we go into kind of look inside the request from Mirage and I go into response, kind of dig in here a bit and look at attributes, you're going to see, okay, body, interactive, whatever. So there's just kind of random words. There's other things in here. I think there's like I think there was one called like sentence or something. Oh, lorem.sentence. So you could say like faker-lorem.sentence.
Spell sentence.
Oh, did I?
Sentence.
Oh, whoops. Yeah, sentence. Thanks. Yeah, there we go. Oh, and it looks like it is already random, so you can just gonna get some gibberish. You can kind of look through Faker and you know, make attributes that are relatively maybe that match your real data as close as possible. Some of these functions, cause this library is sort of independent of Mirage, so if you run into an error where you try one of these and it doesn't work, just it's probably because this one is slightly ahead of the one inside Mirage. So, but for the most part, like a lot of these are already there. Any questions? Yep.
And there's nothing that's gonna display on the page.
The what?
Nothing's gonna display on the page.
Inside templates, index HBS. I guess here, match this.
I think so, it's the same.
The only other thing I can think of is inside the route, make sure you do return this store find all post. Route/index.js. Okay, so we kind of did one part of CRUD, which was let's list out everything. So typically with CRUD pages, there's the next thing where I could say I want to click on one of these items in the list and get more detail. So it's typically called like a details page. So I want to get the details page for a post. So let's make another route for showing the details of a post, which would essentially show like the entire post body. So I'm going to go to the command line, and I'm going to create another route. So I'm going to say Ember generate route posts. Actually, let's okay, let's just call it post. So Ember generate route post. And let's turn each one of these links for each one of these posts in the list. Let's turn it into a link. So I'm going to say link to the post route. So what I kind of want to happen is when I click on one of these items, it's going to link me to /post/5. So this way I'll know, okay, let's load up post 5. So the ID of the post will kind of be put in the URL so that on that page I can, you know, I know which post I'm working with. So if you want to open up the next file, which is router.js, so inside the app folder, there's this router.js, and so we looked at this last week. And so we learned about how to add dynamic segments to a route. So we're going to add a dynamic segment to this route called ID. So in the end, I want to say the path is going to be /post/id. So this ID is kind of like that variable in the URL, also called the dynamic segment. And if we look at our app, okay, now it's broken because it says you attempted to define a link to post but did not pass the parameters required for generating its dynamic segments. So to fix this, we need to go back to index HBS and pass in an ID. So in this case, I want to say post.id. So every post model has an ID. And now it should kind of work again. So this ID is kind of automatically created by Mirage. Now if you kind of hover over each one of these URLs and you look at the little like URL in the bottom left-hand corner, you're going to see, okay, it's all dynamic. So I click on this. I go to post 7, go back, click on post 5 or 6. You can see that, the dynamic segment's being filled in with the ID.
The ID is one off.
Yeah, because it starts off at 0. Oh, let's see, post ID. Yeah, I think
One of them is 0, one of them is 1.
yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think in the factories it starts off as 1, but the ID starts off as 0, so it is 1 off. So actually, if we wanted to fix that just to make it less confusing, we can go into the Mirage factories and just say, let's just do this, I plus 1. Cool. So now, okay, now it all matches up. So a little bit clearer. Okay, so on the details page, now let's load up all the details of a post. So we'll go to our routes, and we're going to go to the post route, and we're going to say, we'll create that model hook, and we're going to say return this.store.find record. So we did find all before to find all the posts. Now we're going to say let's find the single post. And since the post route has the dynamic segment, so the number in the URL that we defined, it receives this as params. And then here we can say params.id. So the .id is the name of the dynamic segment. So looking at router.js, we have path post ID. So ID is the dynamic segment, and that matches up with params.id. So those two, have to be the same. So now if we look at our app, okay, we see we made a GET request to /API/post/5. So if we dig into this and look at the response, kind of what Mirage responded with, you can see that it only responded with just one single thing, not like the entire array. But then if we were to say, like, go back to the list, okay, now it made a request to /API/post. And we can just see all these APIs being kind of hit. Okay, so let's render the data and probably just call it a day. Okay, so inside the post route, let's go to the post template. And because, so the difference between find all and find record, so find all returns, think of it like an array, and find record returns just a single thing. And so if we go to the template, let's say, let's display like an H1, And then in here, we'll say model.title. So the model is basically a post instance. And then we'll create a paragraph underneath that says model.body. Okay, so hopefully you kind of see the description. So if I were to kind of click between all of these and see them, we see that they're all different, but
Why did you post 7 first?
yeah, good question. I wasn't sure if anyone would notice that. Okay, so we look at when we go to the main page, right? It's ordered correctly, and then I visit post 5, and I go back, right? It's all ordered correctly. But if I say go to post 6, refresh the page, and then go back, post 6 is on top, right? And so the reason for this actually stems from, if you look at the API calls here, the first one is I'm going to get /post/5. Then when I go here, it does get API/post. I'm doing that one second. So kind of the way Ember data works is it returns everything that's like already in the cache or in memory. And so when it loads up this page, it sees, oh, post 5 has already been loaded. So it sees it in the cache. So it resolves the find all with that, and then behind the scenes it goes fetches the rest of them, and which is this call right here. And then once those come in, you'll see this. And actually, we could actually see this a little bit better by going to Mirage. And there's a nice little thing where we can say, let's set the timing for this one to like 4,000 seconds. I'm just going to say that one API call is a little bit longer, so 4 seconds. Oh, yeah. We're not going to keep it. But just so you know, I'm just saying, hey, this API call says takes 4 seconds to load. So if I start off with like post 4, this responds, and then I go back. See how post 4 is at the top, but then it's going to wait 4 seconds, and then the rest are going to come in. That's essentially how Ember data works. By default, it says, okay, let's resolve what's already kind of in the cache or in memory, and then go fetch the other ones behind the scenes, and then when it comes in, it'll just come in and render. You can actually change all this to say, hey, only just give it to me when everything is ready, or just when I don't resolve with anything from stuff in the cache. Just say, okay, just give me everything that's fresh from the server. We changed that in the adapter, but that's like a whole nother thing. So it's actually just kind of like a one-liner sort of thing, but it's just another adapter change. So. All right, I think maybe we'll do like one more, and then I'm gonna leave the create and edit because that's a little bit more involved. But I think the delete is easy enough where we can just kind of continue with that. Oh yes.
Question sort of from the beginning. So when you're generating data with Ember Mirage generates that JSON in JSON API,
Yes.
API format.
Yep.
And it gets serialized according to JSON API.
Yep.
And converted into a class. And
Yeah.
that's your model. Okay.
And that becomes your model.
Okay.
So yeah, if we kind of look at that spec a little bit more closely, I think this was also called, article, which basically it's the same as a post. Like what's inside attributes become, like behind the scenes, Ember data is saying new that post model and set some attributes called title and body, and this way we're dealing with like more complex models instead of just like plain little JSON objects. Yeah. And the reason for all this is because like at first it could seem a little bit complicated for doing all this. Like why do this as opposed to $.ajax, right? And it kind of provides a nice layer between what your API gives and your application. So you can imagine like maybe an API one day responded with this, but the next day they changed a bunch of these attributes to be like a whole nother structure, right? Then you have to go and into your app and change every single place, right? Your template, your JavaScript, whatever. Like you have to make it match whatever was returned from the API. Whereas this, it kind of says, keep the application isolated from the API. Just we'll handle the specifics in like one single spot. So if our API changed, but like the format and stuff or the URL, we can change that either in that adapter or the serializer, which we could look at later. Yeah. But I really like just, you know, from a high level, if we look at our code, like our routes, we say, okay, I'm finding all posts, which is like an array of posts. Or on the post route, I'm finding a single thing, which find record, find a single post. So it keeps it very kind of like high level. All right, I think I'm going to cut the delete. Yeah, we'll do that next week. This is probably a lot, looking at how many files there are and stuff.
Wait, isn't that with the midterm?
Yeah, I'm gonna change that a little bit.
So is the midterm not next week?
No. It'll still be next week. I'm just gonna change the content on it because
Wait, so after midterm we still have lecture? Is that what you're saying?
no, we won't have lecture next week. It'll just be the midterm. Okay, so yeah, we'll just kind of end it there for today. Yeah, so if you have questions, yeah, please ask, because it is kind of a lot to take in. Like Mirage, the Ember data, Ember, right? It's okay. So for lab 2, it was a sample midterm. So the first one was like, so I'm gonna probably the midterm is gonna be basically like this, where the first one will be like client-side templating, kind of like your previous homeworks. You can use your previous homeworks, any notes you took. You can look online, just don't chat with each other. But you know you have anything you want pretty much. So the first part will be kind of a client-side templating problem where you'll just kind of take some data and render it. And so if you look at this, I provided an endpoint. So it's just kind of a get call, and we'll just kind of render this data. And then the second one is going to be kind of an Ember one. But originally I had the full CRUD there, but that's too much. So I'm going to cut out like half of it. And so we're going to cut out the create and edit. So for the most part, this will stay the same except for creating, deleting, and editing. So that's like, yeah, 2/5 will stay the same. So I'll update this kind of in lab. And yeah, you have the entire period. Have your homeworks like in your desktop or whatever in a spot that you can easily look at. Yeah, so this lab was just you'll submit it in like 2 different repos. So ITP404 Lab 2 Part 1, and then down here ITP404 Lab 2 Part 2. Okay, so in 2 weeks we'll look at like the deleting, editing, and creating. So just the gets. Okay, so any questions on kind of the code, or do you want me to show certain files? Okay, so highly recommend kind of checking out these links. So the REST slides, just to kind of remember those REST API conventions. And Mirage has a lot of really good things. I mean, this will probably be more useful in like 3 weeks when we kind of do the full CRUD, but you can do a lot of customizations with it. We just kind of took the defaults because it's really nice to get started, but we can customize a lot of this if we need to. All right, so I'll stop this.